Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
All right, welcome back to Pasture Prime Time with your host, me, Neil Smith. As always, we're here talking to some wonderful individuals and guests, sharing stories from the field, sharing their experience with regeneration. And today I'm really excited to have all the way from California, I think you're in right now, Caleb.
Oregon.
Okay, not too far, just up the road a little bit. You were in California last time I talked to you. So Caleb is joining us today. He's someone I've got to know over the last year or so, and really has a strong background in that ecological system design, something that I spend a lot of time on. We got to lay the foundation and build those designs so that we can start actually doing the field work, hands and dirt, and we know what we're doing. And it's both as much for the environment as it is for our costing plans, just to make sure the systems of systems are put together effectively. So I'm quite excited that Caleb took me up on the offer to join us and have a conversation. And I hope you will listen attentively and really take away something from this conversation. So Caleb, thanks for being here. Maybe for our audience, what you could do is share with us a little bit of your background and kind of where we cross paths, but importantly, what your background is.
Yeah. So agriculture has always been my main focus. I grew up running around in the forest as a kid and knew pretty early on that I wanted to work with plants and animals. I got the first advanced agricultural science diploma our high school ever offered. My counselor in high school thought I was nuts for wanting to do that. She was like, why in the world would you do that in ag? Because most of the kids getting advanced science diplomas were going for like nursing or med degrees or things like that. And it just seemed like a crazy thing, I guess, to them. It was like, no, we need more of this. We need more people that are focused in on learning the nuance that is agriculture, right? So then continue that on into college, doing the same thing. I actually started out getting an ag education degree and realized that wasn't going to let me be hands-on enough. Swapped over to an animal science degree, and then dropped out because I started managing a large bison ranch in southern Missouri. So I managed a large bison ranch for a little while, moved off to managing a large market garden on another large ranch, and then went off and started my wife and I's own farm. And we ran that for about 8-9 years before deciding to move up to Kansas City for a year and manage another farm there. I'd love trying to get all the experience I can with as many different systems as possible. I think that's been key to kind of understanding as much as I can. And then now we have started the process of moving out here to Oregon. So we have visited the coast out here for years and absolutely love it. So that has caused this shift of now I get to take the experience I've built up over the last 16 or so years of working in ag into design work, because I'm not on my own place, which I wish I would have done way earlier on, because that entire time that we had our little farm for that 8 or 9 years, the things that I do now for other folks' farms on, on a sheet of paper, I'm like, man, I really wish I'd put that gate that way on my farm, right? I have so many old YouTube videos and stuff of me clopping through a wet gate because it's in exactly the wrong spot and things like that I'm like, man, if I'd have known what I know about design now, I wouldn't have those problems. So
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, we learn by trial and fire, and it's part of agriculture. Every year gets better, or as we always say, there's always next year. I'd be really curious if you could share with the audience a little bit about some of the design aspects you take. We hear this word permaculture, and it may be something that we don't talk about enough, but I don't think it's divergent of agriculture as a whole. I think there are systems and designs that go into that. We have landscape architecture, that filters into some of the design planning. We have greening design spectrums, more for urban centers. But maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those methodologies, techniques, processes that you use to help you craft some of the design that you put together.
Yeah, so I think the easiest thing is my ag teacher used to lose his mind anytime he would try to talk to me about something, because I would always go, but what about that piece? Like, we're throwing this thing away, we're not using this thing here. Like, when I competed in forestry in high school. So we'd go out and we'd thin trees and we'd have these big slash piles that we'd just pile up. And he used to always just go, Caleb, stop trying to tell me that we're going to use this thing or use this thing or that thing. And he'd just be focused on what logs were we pulling out of this stand of timber. And I'm sitting there, even as a high schooler, going, oh man, I'm sure we could get wood chips. We could inoculate mushroom logs from the smaller diameter branches. We could do this and that. So as I got older and discovered permaculture and found that and was like, oh my gosh, people have been doing this. Like, this is phenomenal, right? We take these things that are what would be considered waste, or we're just going to pile up as big slash piles and burn. And those actually help our farms become more sustainable, both ecologically, but also financially, right? When we're looking at this going, this is a whole system. And so for me, that's where permaculture kind of comes in, is this idea that every bit of our farm should work for us and for the land, not just a, well, what little piece can I pull out here and there? And when we started doing that, especially like on our own farm, we started seeing, oh my gosh, so we have all these wet, muddy spots, right? Our farm was a wonderful little marsh a lot of the times of the year. We just started realizing, well, why don't we just start planting willow? And so we started planting willow cuttings that were ornamental varieties of willow cuttings and incorporating those into hedge lines and into the marshier spots on the farm, creating a secondary crop that also started drastically jumping up the amount of insects that we started seeing on our farm. But it coupled very nicely with running pigs on there. We got rid of sheep, right? We just started looking at how does the land want to actually work, and just started shifting that. And so for me, when I work on a design, it's looking at the land and trying to figure out, what does this land actually want, and how many enterprises can we stack on this so that the waste from one thing shifts over to being its own valuable product. And oftentimes we run into the situation where it's like, I think you'll actually make more money off the waste product than you are going to off of your main product.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And looking at all those little nuances, like we did a project, right, with the fence lines, and looking at how, yeah, we could run a dozer through here and make some swales on these hillsides, or we could just put your fences on keyline, your permanent fences, so that when the cows are constantly just pacing along the fence when they're in a paddock, they're creating that little swale. And while it might not be much, we start popping those on keyline down the whole thing, even just that little bit of water is going to start shifting where we want. And so it's working with the land and with those little subtleties that work on a landscape.
I love that. And maybe just for our audience, so you want to explain what keyline is?
Yeah. So this one, I hate to admit it, but it actually really was hard for me to fathom when I first started reading about it, because it just did not make sense. When you hear people like Darren Doherty talk about, we're moving water from valleys to the drier hillsides, and you're like, how in the world did you do that? So the goal being that, and I'm going to try to not have, we were talking about this before the show, but this nice halo behind my head. We were trying to take where that water is coming in, right? But that water is coming in like this in a valley as it runs down. So we're taking it from this higher spot in our valley and going downhill to the side to get it over. So when we're looking at something with keyline, we're trying to take it where the water is wanting to collect and shifting it over to a spot on a hillside where it's going to want to run that way. So when we're putting ponds, we're putting things like that, the goal is to get them from a collection spot higher up and shift it over. And we can do that, right, with ponds. We can do that just simply with causing drainage sideways back out onto those drier hillsides, so that then we don't have as marshy of a spot up on a hillside or up in a valley part of a hillside, but over on this nice thing, spreading out that water and giving it a chance to actually soak in on your ground there. So that, and one of the things I worked at with a property out here in Eastern Oregon was actually taking that and showing that we have these springs that kind of start to pop up, and they're very intermittent, and they do seem to show up when we remove some junipers, but that's a whole nother thing. And I read a lot of papers on junipers. I could go through a crazy rabbit hole on that. But showing how if we shift this from here over to this other, we might actually increase our spring flow because we need it to soak in, right? And so shifting that around and looking actually at soil topography layers and going, well, we actually see that over here, right, we may here have just a lot of gravel. But if we shift this over to this spot where we've got actually a hard pan, we might actually be able to store that water subsoil by just shifting it across the hillside into a different soil type.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. Sometimes boggles my mind what we can think of and how we create different system designs within our ecosystem, particularly on hillsides. And I grew up in the mountains, and so playing around with different systems up there versus flatland is always a bit of a trip for me, because I'm very versed on having that topography that I can actually counter and play with. And on the flatland, it's very different, though. You can technically do the same things, you just have to think about it from a different angle.
Yeah, and it's not as fun. It really is one of those things where sometimes you look at just a flat side and you're like, well, I could do anything, therefore it's not as much fun as something that you're like, half these things won't work, so we can't do that. So now we've got to be creative.
Very true. I'd love to get your perspective on this. I hate to call it a rift, but this divide or this delta between, call it agriculturalists and permaculturalists. What's your view on that?
Oh, man. Yeah, because there is one, right? There often is one. And I think it's something I face a lot, because a lot of, when we look at the farms I've managed in the past, right? I have managed at scale. Our Bison ranch was 1,200 acres, 1,200 or 1,600 acres. I get the two ranches I did back to back, flopped on land scale, but large, right? And this isn't, I mean, we talk out west here, and 1,600, 1,200 acres is nothing. I'm talking 1,200, 1,600 acres in southern Missouri. So where we're at one cow per 1 to 5 acres, right? We're talking, we can really get dense on if we set graze. And then we started taking a ranch like that, and we're breaking it down. When I did apple orchard in Kansas City, we were doing 5 acres of high density apples, so 1,000 trees per acre. We were doing 4 acres of RCA trellis blackberries, things on scale. And I think that's where the problem comes in. Is permaculturalists, we often think in small scale, because we realize that burden of abundance that can happen when you start thinking with permaculture methodologies, of, like I said earlier, with all these different enterprises that begin to stack. And when we look at that from our more conventional agriculture viewpoint, we're like, the amount of labor it would take to do that is kind of insane. And you begin to try to tell this one farmer who is struggling to manage this big farm that's growing one thing or maybe 2 or 3 crops, right? And you start saying, well, you should do this, 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 and you go on with a list of what you can do with permaculture, and they begin to think you're crazy. There's no way I could do that. And so that's where that kind of happens, because you see all these permaculture scale farms are often small because of the amount of labor involved. And so that means that the amount of product pushed out is also small, right? We're trying to mash in, these couple little things here and there. So for me, it's trying to figure out, how do we merge those two? How do we still utilize those permaculture ethics and practices, but on a scale that is, we added apple trees into this design, but we've added enough apple trees that we can actually afford to hire somebody who this is what their job is they manage these apple trees. And it makes enough revenue off just those apple trees, that one crop, that it's viable, versus being this one guy is now trying to do a dozen different things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was really well put. And I personally, I really try to dispel this divide or this delta that happens between the two. I think for me, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes permaculturalists are grouped into the bunker mentality lifestyle, hide away from society, build your remote island that nobody can get into, and have all the systems designed in there. And yet it has nothing to do with that. It's actually creating, for me, when I went through and did my PDC, which is my permaculture design course, it really helped me understand the linkage, that engineering system of system thinking, where we were talking ecological systems, which you don't typically get. In agriculture specifically, we're often focusing on crop types or, two different integrations, but we're not talking about that long-term domino effect of linkages. And certainly the veracity of different environment pieces that we need to consider, where permaculture really sort of takes that in as a holistic view, right? But I think too often it's really these individuals that kind of want to hide away from what's happening in the world today, for right or wrong. I'm not judging that, and they're often the ones that sort of follow this dogma of permaculture in terms of building that sanctuary for themselves. And I just don't think it's the right perspective to have. I think both work very well together. And permaculture, we're talking about that system of system thinking.
So I noticed that when I was first getting into this, right, when I was starting to look at this stuff in college and onward, and because that's what you see a lot of, especially if you look at like older videos and older talks and everything, and it is this kind of mentality of like, well, I'm going to go make my little oasis off somewhere, where I need a ton of land to do this. And I think I finally went through and just got my PDC recently because it's one of those things where I've attended a bunch of free PDCs or watched a ton of the videos and read the books, and then finally was like, I know all these systems. I need to go ahead and actually get the certification versus just saying, oh, I've attended a bunch of these.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I noticed from most of my education being in these older sources and then getting a more recent PDC, a lot of the other students in that PDC, and then that I've gotten to, connect more with that community through that, are drastically different from those older groups of that. That mentality seems to have just kind of shifted off. And I don't know if that's, this bigger thing of land access being harder or what, but a lot of the people that I'm seeing now are actually these smaller and urban areas, especially, where people are like, oh, I want to just convert my backyard, or I want to tear down the fence between me and my neighbor's yard. Like someone in ours was talking about like removing the fence between them and their neighbor's yard so that they could convert that into one space. And so I'm beginning to see more of this community aspect that is coming in, which has always been a part of permaculture. But when you look at the older permaculture, it was, well, we'll take a small group of us and we'll move out to the middle of the woods somewhere and do this, right? And now it's, let's do this kind of where we are and build a community here and work together, which is what I think we need more of. Is we need these urban areas to be more productive. And I think we're starting to see more of that versus that kind of bug out mentality. It's, we need to build community here.
Yeah, I like that. Let's change tracks a little bit. Let's talk about some really cool designs. In particular, when we think about, and maybe we can introduce wildlife. So when we think about bringing beavers back to the land,
That makes me happy.
yes, I'm Canadian. Of course, I got to go with the Canadian beaver. But what does that look like from you? And calling it, like when we see in Europe and in England in particular, or the United Kingdom, they're really big on rewilding, and it's really bringing the wildlife back in to do a lot of the work that humans don't need to do. Beavers have a love-hate relationship. I know at my own farm, they fell trees that I don't want fallen. And in fact, what I've learned over the years is they don't actually saw trees to knock them over. They're actually just sharpening their teeth, but they pick out trees that are in the process of dying. And so they're great identifiers, early identifiers of trees that potentially are on their last legs or diseased or have issues. Nonetheless, they'll create a lot of havoc on shelter belts and on silver pasture setups that I've put into play. But I'd love to hear a little bit about some cool designs that you've worked on where you've integrated wildlife back into the environment, and then maybe as a secondary, your views on beavers.
Yeah, that sounds great. So for me, integrating livestock or wildlife, both, right? We look at, historically, there was a lot more wildlife in North America. And something I have to constantly have in conversations with people are these ideas of carrying capacity, and how carrying capacity means two drastically different things to two different sets of people, right? I talk to a lot of people that, they'll say, well, deer are overpopulated here. And then you look at the population of deer in the area and you're like, actually, no, you're drastically under historical averages, but you're at social carrying capacity. So what will the people in the area, like how many are we hitting with our cars? And how many of our shrubs are they eating, right? So we look at that societal carrying capacity versus the actual environmental carrying capacity. And so my goal with my designs is always to work with, well, how do we increase not just that social carrying capacity, but also the actual environmental carrying capacity of our land for that wildlife, so that we're not competing with wildlife, we're working in tandem with wildlife. And a lot of that just stems from choosing plant species, both to farm and to just put out, that are native to that area, because those plants increase our carrying capacity. So when I look at designs, my goal is always to find, is there an alternative species that maybe it's not as developed as it could be, but we could get there, and that would be a niche product for your farm that you could do at scale that increases that environmental carrying capacity. Thankfully, we have things like elderberries that are a huge popular thing. We can put those in, and that's thankfully seeing a big growth. But it's not just elderberries. It's going like out here on the Pacific Northwest coast, right? It's looking at things like, well, can we, instead of doing berries like normal berries, right? Maybe we start trying to grow salmon berries, thimbleberries. You've got so many different types of huckleberries out here, and they're very popular, and they demand a much higher price than these other crops, but they also produce those environmental benefits. So not only are you doing that, but you're also creating that little bit of that increases wildlife carrying capacity. So I try to, when doing designs, go, where we need flowers in this landscape. This needs to look nice, or we're wanting to produce seeds to sell. Well, why don't we look at some of these native wildflowers in your area? And that's the kind of things we specialize in, so that each of those crops creates some wildlife benefit while working with what we want to do. And to shift over to the beavers aspect of it, that's the same thing, right? We look at that and we go, yes, beavers look like they cause a lot of damage, but I mean, so do we, right? We put a parking lot or a road through here, that creates damage. But when the beaver does that, yeah, they chew those trees down, but maybe we shift to, because what they're doing is, right, they're trying to coppice those trees and they're trying to expand that wetland. So while they look bad for riparian areas, what they've done is they've just made your riparian area bigger. Sometimes we don't want that riparian area bigger, but if that's what that area is, we look at these flat sections of landscape between valleys and we go, well, that used to be a floodland, so it's probably going to return to a floodland if we bring beavers in. But then that shifts back to like what we did on my farm. We just started planting more willows, right? These bottomlands are great then where we have beaver coming in for planting willows, for planting elderberries, for planting otherberries, and looking at working with beavers and going, well, maybe we make that a park right through there, or maybe we make that a spot where we're growing some of these riparian plants for flower cuttings, for basketry, for stuff like that, and just working with them and going, cool, I don't need to worry about trying to irrigate that area because now I have a beaver doing it. I just need to grow a different crop right there.
Yeah, I like that. And I appreciate that you didn't get into hunting of the beavers. It's about working with them in the ecosystem. Yeah. So we've covered some terminology, and maybe we'll just keep on that thread a little bit. And you're doing a great job in giving some different food for thought on some of these terms that we hear. So I'd love your take on what regenerative agriculture means. You and I talk about it quite a bit, and I'd love for you to share with the audience some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So for me, when I look at regenerative agriculture, I think of, we are attempting to heal these aspects of this, right? When I look at soil tests from different folks' farms, when I look out at a landscape, right, I don't just look at, well, what does that look like right now? I also look at, what did that used to be? And if we just left it alone, right, which a lot of times it just means it's going to fill back in with some invasive species. So we know that nature has these abilities to heal a landscape, and oftentimes very fast. After a fire, right, we get coppicing. After beavers chew stuff down, we get coppicing. We get massive herds of animals that'll knock through an area and smash that down, and the impacts that you can see on soil are drastic from there. But if we just left it alone, what would it do? And so for me, when I think regenerative agriculture, like when I'm looking at a neighborhood design or a farm design, I tend to go from the baseline of, okay, so what is the environmental things that are going to happen if we just left this alone? How much food would we produce if we were just trying to hunt this, if we were just trying to forage this, and we just left it alone? How much carbon is going to be sequestered by letting it return to brush? And going, okay, that's the baseline. When we talk regenerative, we want to go above that. Not, if we're farming it, we want to do better than what it would be if we're farming. That's sustainable, right? If we're just trying to do better than what it is farming, that's sustainable. But if we go up to that environmental aspect of, what is it going to do if I left it alone and wasn't messing with this, that's regenerative, right? So when we talk about creating these riparian belts that we're actively working in, so we're actively harvesting and coppicing. I say that word all the time because I absolutely love coppicing. It brings me so much joy to think that I'm cutting something down, but making more and sequestering more carbon out of doing it. So that's regenerative for me, right? That we can have these cows here and they can be here, and if we just left them alone and let deer run through there, that's going to do X. But if I bunch those cows real nice and tight and then rotate them off, the amount of carbon that I can sequester down, the amount of insect species that I can bring in that are then going to feed quail, which then we can go out and hunt, or it's going to bring in pheasants or things like that. That's what gets me real happy with regenerative, is thinking of how much we can increase that carrying capacity by doing these practices.
Yeah, I really like that. It's a definition that I've started using as well, actually, is how do we steward the land to have more carrying capacity? When people ask, what is regenerative ag? And carrying capacity can look different based on bioregion, right? And
Yes.
specifically we're trying to do, and whether that is your permaculture property, your homestead, or whether that is a full-blown production agriculture entity, the carrying capacity is going to be equivalent to what you want to put out. But I really liked what you said about how do we remove ourselves and extract ourselves, and does the system still work? Is it dependent on us as humans, or can it actually start functioning in a way that is very intuitive and regenerative, self-cycling? And I think that is always the metrics. I actually stand on the premise of saying I don't think there is any regenerative land or systems that I've seen in North America to date that are self-generating. Even our forests are fairly humanly involved. I think we're very much in a rehabilitation, resuscitation, rejuvenation phase of reclamation work, maybe is the best way, not to have too many R words, within our ecosystems. And that regenerative is really going to be an end goal. And whether we get there or not, a little bit up to us. But
So
it's,
I think we're actually differing just a little bit on
yeah,
this.
great.
I'm not saying that the goal should be to work people out of the system. I think that
Mm,
the one thing that humans are good at, like the number one thing we're good at, is creating chaos and creating change in an ecosystem. We are the number one ecosystem engineer species on the planet. I mean, I'm sure we wish. I don't think that's me beeping.
no, that was my computer going off there. Sorry.
Beavers are stellar, but the amount of environmental change that we can bring about puts beavers to shame. And I am someone that is a huge beaver fan, so that like big difference there. So I think that humans always need to be a part of these systems, and that's we have been right in North America. These systems have been managed by humans for thousands and thousands of years to create that abundance that was here. And I mean, we look at the studies coming out of the Amazon, right, where it's like, oh, this has been a food forest that has been managed for thousands of years to create this level of abundance. I think humans need to be a part of that system. We just need to be working within it from that framework of this is a system, and we are here to create more abundance and work with the system. So I'll never think that like the end goal of regenerative is to move humans out, because how are you going to rotate mobs of cows without people to move fences unless we just get completely out of the way and we create large scale areas of bison, which even then, that was humans shifting bison around and not only just hurting them, but also burning great swaths of prairie so that then not only to keep back trees from growing in that prairie, but if you ever walk out onto a fresh burn, maybe about 3, 4 days later, it is sickly sweet smelling in a lot of the areas of the prairie from all that new green grass shooting up. And if I can smell it with my horrible human nose, you know deer and bison and cows can smell it. I've had cows pacing fence lines on burns before right afterwards because they can smell that green grass coming up and that's what they want. So I've seen a few studies that talk about how they were actually using burns to encourage bison, deer, and elk to move to these new areas so that you don't need to chase them down, just burn into the section right over there and kind of move a little
Yeah.
bit.
No, you're so right. And I appreciate the clarification there. I always think about extracting ourselves because I think at one point I like to get, maybe that's that rewilding component of my brain that comes in. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the studies and the information show that we're part of an ecosystem, and so working with it versus against it. And I do love that sort of charring event and the burning events that do happen. We had some wildfire at our farm early spring this year, and so I was cleaning up some of the fields, and I was actually surprised how much regrowth was there. Not necessarily the things I wanted, but nonetheless, it was the things that were native, right? And actually, there was some docile, dormant native seeds that were germinating and regrowing because of the fires that came through. And so this is needed, and that observational visibility and awareness and sensory component is very important in how we manage the land. Just as we're thinking about into the sort of the latter part of our conversation here, um, I'd love to hear in particular how technology has played a part in how you're looking at land today, and potentially that's a positive, a negative, or a neutral. But technology is so viable and at our fingertips, and just about everything we do is connected to a technology output of some sort. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. How does technology play a role in what you're doing?
This is for folks who aren't as tied into this. This might freak some people out because this is a common thing I get, especially from like family members who I'll just like do something with a piece of their property for them online that they won't realize that a lot of this information is out there. And I use a lot of free software. So I'm not talking stuff that you have to pay a bunch of money for. I could not do the design work that I do if it wasn't for this software. I have now done designs all across the country and not going to them. There are so many places. Again, like we can think the map is not the land. There are things that I have to clarify for people that, like, I'm taking a guess at based off what I can see online. If I'm wrong and you've moved something, like people dug a hole here, now that might shift your hydrology. But without the level of technology that we have right now, I would not be able to do this level of design work. So I feel like I've been able to spread that through that. And talking about, friends and family with that kind of stuff and other clients, it's easy enough to pop on so many of these different mapping softwares and GIS softwares and things like that and go, here in this hidden spot on your property, you have a thing. Is that this? And then I'll often get people go, oh my gosh, how did you know I put that car back there? Or this or that I thought might have been a barn or something. Yeah, we do have a spring right there. Like we had this one property where I was looking at the breaks in the different soil types, and one had this hard pan layer, and it broke into this area of clay, and it was right where two valleys came together. And I said, I think we might have a spring here. Let's look at that. And sure enough, that client was like, yeah, no, there's a spring that comes right in there. It's always a little green. And I couldn't see it because trees were covering that whole area. Right. But yeah, there was green grass popping out right in that area. And it was those two soil layers that all of that has been mapped by the USDA. And I can see your topography. And so where that topography ties with a soil layer break, we've got a chance for something like that. And I can see all of that online. And without that, it would involve walking thousands of acres and taking a guess and having to see it all times of the year. I can click back through aerial photography month by month, year by year for a lot of properties that I don't have to be on that property for years at a time.
Yeah, I like it from that aspect. Of course, probably where I'm going with this conversation is, how does that data get captured and who owns that data, if it's tied. But in premise, efficiencies that have been gained and given us, some line of sight on properties, and particularly in a remote world. I mean, you're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast right now.
Yep.
Being able to use these tools, to get some really great and really detailed understanding of what that land is. And so that we can start the design process, we can start thinking about the questions to ask, and how to, better integrate into the land. One of the things that, we talk about, and I think a lot of people think about design being, topographical, because that's the maps we've seen. We've been, topo maps.
Yep.
But we get into, detailed satellite imagery and spectrometry, that's giving us granular levels of detail. We can even see below the soil, to a degree. There's a percentage of soil that comes up. But how much does understanding biomass on land play an effect in how you design for an agriculture property or an agriculture enterprise?
Yeah. So easy enough with some of those basics of seeing, like, is this an area that looks like it's probably just some dense trees? Is this an area of open pasture? And then trying to puzzle out, well, why is that behaving that way? That soil layer comes in really handy. We can go, oh, well, this is right. There's a higher layer of rocks, so the grass isn't really wanting to thrive right there. But balancing out that with trying to guess, why are we seeing these levels of consistent biomass tending to be this way, or even is it a human managed thing, right? Is this something that, like, oh, this is just the easiest spot? Because sometimes we'll see some spots where it looks funny and it's like, why is the land doing this? Like, if it was me, I might continue my pasture right on through that area, and you find it was a human thing, like, oh, well, that's where the fence has just always been. But yeah, kind of balancing out some of that. And with a lot of the software I use, I can't get as detailed as might be nice if we walk a landscape. And that's been some of the things on our trip heading from Missouri to moving out here to Oregon, has been kind of neat to be on site to a few places and seeing that a bit more in person. But I know the software is there.
Yeah, that's really neat. I appreciate that. When we think about some of the things that a new individual into land stewarding should be thinking about, what are some of the top things from your perspective that they should be focusing on to make sure that they start tackling the land in the right way?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, just learn a lot, right? So this is what I mentioned in my introduction, has just been about learning. And that's every single day. I'm always trying to listen to another podcast, read another book, and it's while doing other things. That's what I love about today's day and age. That's my favorite thing about technology, is the ability to throw an audiobook in, and I can still be out working and doing something and have an audiobook in, or I can have a podcast in. There's so much information out there nowadays that honestly, I look back sometimes and I laugh at degrees, or I think get this idea of going back to college and going, most of that information is out there. I just got to find the right sources to get it from. So that's what I would do, is just, if you're getting into this, there is so much to learn and you'll never learn it all. I feel like I learn something new every day, and I've been learning this stuff for nearly 20 years now. There's always some little thing that gives you a click, and get out there and make mistakes. Get on the land and do stuff, because most of the things you're going to make a mistake with, you can fix it if you realize why that was a mistake, right? And like when I put in my fences, I really wish I was doing more temporary fences and just getting a stronger charger, because a lot of the permanent fences I put in were one of those things that was like, I really regret putting that permanent fence there. So take a PDC, just take as many courses as you can, get out and work with as many people out on the land as you can, because if you can not make the same mistakes they did and make your own mistakes, you're going to be a lot better off.
Totally. And I'll drop some breadcrumbs here. At Grow, for the audience listening, we actually have what's called a land NFT coming out pretty soon. That's going to give you some of that digital, take the pulse of your land information. And so a number of different visualizations, and we'll call these maps, and that are going to allow you to start to take some of the information that you're learning with this digital information and go create some projects and systems. And don't forget, Caleb is part of the Grow community. We have a Grow community of thought leaders, subject matter experts, people that love to help. This is a great community to tap into as well. There's some great information here and some great opportunities. So if you're just starting your land project, you're new to farming, or you're just looking to improve where you are today and allow us to meet you where you are, I think Grow has an abundance of knowledge and wealth that you can really tap into. And so I highly recommend reaching out and having some good conversations. Yeah. Caleb, before we end, what's going on in your neck of the woods? Is there anything that you think our audience should know about? Is there any events, fairs? Are you hosting a big barbecue at your place?
No. So I am currently on the Oregon coast. Like I said, so we sold our farm in Missouri and we've been traveling and moving up here. So I'm just currently looking for wherever we want to land here on the Pacific Northwest and attempting to learn the ecology here of the Pacific Northwest, because it is very different from the Midwest. And there's a lot I can learn online, but I've been focusing very heavily on doing a lot of hiking, wandering a lot of the shores and woods out here. So yeah, there's always some new thing going on out here, it seems like, to be able to get out and try to learn. But yeah, beyond that, it's just trying to figure this place out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Caleb. I look forward to many conversations as you get settled in Oregon there. We have some community members out in Oregon, actually, some big ranchers. I'd love to put you in touch. But the opportunities, I think, are in abundance of what we can do and where we can grow together. And so thanks very much for being on this episode. And we will catch you on the next Pasture Prime Time. Make sure to tune in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Neil.